Well, good morning, everyone. This is the session on climate action in FCV. Very pleased to see you all here. We are still waiting for a few more participants to join us. We have a very tight schedule in the Fragility Forum, so there is like one session after the other, but we are going to start because actually we have some of the panelists joining from Asia, and it's already very late. So let me first briefly introduce myself. My name is Beatrice Maser. I'm the Executive Director at the World Bank. I represent 9 countries, among them also Switzerland, where I'm from. Now, before we begin, a quick note on questions and engagement from the audience. We would very much like it to be an interactive discussion. So please, there is an online system throughout the session to submit questions. We also have a technical chat moderator who can help respond to some of the questions and points coming in. And I will also draw on questions submitted online as well as questions from the room when we get to the audience discussion. Now, the title, Climate Action in FCV, Luxury or Lifeline. This title was chosen quite deliberately. It is meant to be provocative. As you know, in many fragile and conflict-affected settings, climate action can easily be seen as something that belongs further down the list of priorities. Governments and communities are often dealing with multiple challenges, displacements, food insecurity, fiscal stress, and the practical realities of recovery and reconstruction. In that context, in those difficult contexts, it is fair to ask, is climate action really an immediate priority, or is it a secondary concern that should wait until more basic stability is achieved? But the other side of the question is just as important. Climate shocks are not waiting for stability. They are already affecting livelihoods, food systems, health, and fragile and conflict-affected contexts are disproportionately exposed to climate hazards such as droughts, floods, and extreme weather. FCV countries are among the most exposed globally. Over 70% of people living in fragile states are highly vulnerable to climate impacts. So the question is not simply whether climate action matters. The harder question is how climate action can be made relevant to the immediate choices that governments, communities, donors, and development institutions are already facing. So today, we will have a discussion about all these topics. I hope it's going to be a frank and lively discussion. Let us try to avoid simply repeating corporate or organizational lines. I hope also that we can hear where is agreement or where there is disagreement, and where the tensions between governments, donors, climate finance actors, and development institutions arise. So let's put them on the table so we can find solutions to those. We are very fortunate to have a very strong panel bringing together all these different perspectives, like climate finance, climate diplomacy, human mobility, and the development finance perspective. Let me also note the global report on maximizing the peace and social dividends on climate action. This report will be released next week, but it has already been discussed in some of the panels over these last days. And Switzerland also contributed with a case study together with the World Bank to this report. So from Switzerland's perspective, reaching the most vulnerable and making sure we do no harm while staying sensitive to conflict contexts is a core element of our international cooperation. To live up to that, Switzerland is working to better integrate fragility, conflict, and vulnerability considerations into climate action and climate finance. Because when this is done well, the potential co-benefits can be quite significant. But let me now turn to our panel round. I will introduce the different panelists at the beginning when I hand over the floor to them. And I will ask them to respond for roughly 6 to 7 minutes. And I might come back with some brief follow-up question if time allows. I would encourage the panelists to be concrete. You have a lot of specific and concrete experience. So I think this is always very good for us, particularly also at the board, to hear the concrete experience, because this is where we can make the difference. Tell us if something works and tell us why. If something does not work, tell us that as well. And if there are trade-offs, we sometimes avoid discussing. Obviously, this is the perfect session to discuss them. To the audience online and also in the room, please continue submitting questions through the online systems as we go. Again, the chat moderator will also respond to them. So let me now introduce our first speaker, who is joining us from very far away. Is Mafalda Duarte. She is the Executive Director of the Green Climate Fund. She's a climate economist. She previously led the climate investment funds and held senior positions at the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Mafalda, you are online. Let me come to you first. I know that you are joining virtually from South Korea. So thank you so much for being here. I know it's very late or maybe already very early in the morning. So thank you so much for being here with us. In this segment, I would like to bring in the dedicated climate fund and access co-finance dimension. In many fragile settings, the central question is not whether climate finance exists, but whether it can actually reach the communities that need it most. And the hard choices financing institutions such as the Green Climate Fund face about where and how to engage. The Green Climate Fund has become one of the leading sources of climate finance for fragile and conflict-affected states, committing close to $500 million in such settings in 2025 alone. And you have pushed a more proactive, country-driven approach. Therefore, the question to you, from the fund's vantage point, where is climate finance most clearly a lifeline rather than a luxury in fragile settings? And how can access to be redesigned so that the money actually reaches the most vulnerable and conflict-affected while still delivering resilience, livelihoods, and stability? Over to you, Mafalda.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I hope that you can hear me, and it's quite a privilege to be a part of this Fragility Forum, and I'm really sorry that I can't be there in person, but really delighted to be here and really welcoming the provocative theme, is this a luxury or a lifeline, as a matter of fact. Also, congratulations to the World Bank for the upcoming or released Maximizing Peace Dividends from Adaptation, the flagship report. So as you highlighted, Beatrice, I think it's really important to understand that climate risk is actually quite concentrated in fragile states, and the fragility risk is actually exacerbating climate vulnerability. So these things are quite interconnected. And in a world where we are so preoccupied with security, it's actually quite important to understand these synergies and convergences between these topics. I think we need to understand that 17 of the 25 most climate vulnerable countries are actually FCV settings. Also important to understand in a world where we are quite focused again on conflicts, on migration, that climate shocks have actually been a key driver of internal displacements. Actually, over the last decade, 220 million people And in FCV settings, this is actually 3 times more people are affected than in other geographies. And so this linkage between poverty, climate, instability is quite clear. And this is actually, these areas are converging into a single systemic risk, and where conflict actually reduces capacity to respond to climate shocks. But the climate shocks are also straining fragile social and institutional systems, and they amplify competition over resources, and they really disrupt growth trajectories and, of course, the intent of eliminating poverty. So, as you said, Beatrice, at the Green Climate Fund, we have been prioritizing these countries. We have committed over $3 billion, and in total mobilized an additional $5 billion. So in total, $8 billion in a short period of time. Last year alone, as you said, $500 million, and we have in our hands another $1 billion of pipeline. So how do we see climate finance reducing fragility? So there are 5 main areas, and I'll try to be very brief and can come back later in the discussion. One is by trying to lower pressure on shared resources. So we know well that in these fragile settings, climate shocks are intensifying competition over resources, land, water, energy. And these obviously climate shocks are worsening food insecurity, driving social unrest and localized conflict. So we have examples, several examples, one of which I think it's featured in the flagship report as well, in Sri Lanka, where targeting not necessarily around ethnic divisions, but actually targeting a basin-based design across ethnic groups, and by doing that, by establishing cross-community water councils to manage these shared resources, or farmer organizations also across ethnic groups, and so turning really these contested resources into shared systems of cooperation. And by doing so, creating jobs, income, and importantly, building trust amongst these ethnic groups. So that's one big area. The other one is trying to be preventive, or and not just reacting post-disaster or post-climate shock. It is well known that if we support early warning systems and climate information systems, we can actually reduce the damage and the impacts by 30%. And of course, this with its own fiscal and economic implications. And again, several examples of this being done, including one of our most recent interventions in Somalia, to really provide 1.5 million people with better information, climate information, and therefore help them inform their decisions as well. The third big area is what we call building buffers. We also know that households that have savings or have diversified income sources are 30 to 50% less likely to survive, more likely to fall into, less likely to fall into poverty after these climate shocks. And so one example of trying to build these buffers, once again, another example in Iraq, really targeting modern irrigation, solar power pumps, water user associations. So building these buffers. And let me say as well that let us not just think that these are public sector investments. Actually, we have quite a number of private sector projects in these countries, around $3.5 billion, including one in Djibouti, where we actually supported the first utility-scaled wind farm that actually increased the national energy supply by 50%. Fourth important area is also to think about the systems and the institutions and how we can strengthen those institutional capacity gaps, which are quite significant in these settings, as we know. And the way we are doing this is by strengthening national entities, both public and private, to access finance, helping build project pipelines, and really supporting the governments with their institutional capacity and the policy and regulatory framework. We are also embedding expertise in governments and again, trying to build the local financial institutions ecosystem. One example in Senegal, where we helped strengthen La Banque Agricole, and with this, they managed to establish their own climate-smart agriculture financing facility for underserved regions, but other examples in Palestine and other geographies as well. Lastly, I would say social protection is really important to act as last mile delivery system to really reach the most vulnerable. What happens in these settings as well is that the social protection systems tend to be quite thin or fragmented or absent altogether. So this is one area where we have started making investments and are exploring what more we can do. I'm mindful of my time. Let me just say that because this is also supposed to be a bit provocative. I mean, one of the things we have to realize is that the finance will flow a lot more easier and at larger scale, not particularly to these settings. The finance much more easily flows to where institutions are stable, where risk is measurable, where there are delivery channels that are predictable and solid. So there has to be a deliberation and adjusting modalities to be effective in these contexts, and also bring the right partnerships to bear. Otherwise, if there is no deliberation, more likely to happen is that the finance will continue to flow to the easier places. Thank you. Over to you, Beatrice.
Well, thank you very much, Mafalda, for putting out the relationship between climate finance and fragility, and also for enlightening us on how the Green Climate Fund works. You put out very concrete examples, which is much appreciated. And I'm sure our other panelists will be able to sort of continue with what you have put as a foundation here. So let me turn now to our next panelist. It's a pleasure for me to introduce His Excellency Dr. Mohamed Yulde Yallo. He is the Vice President of the Republic of Sierra Leone since 2018. Before he took national office, he held senior United Nations positions across the Sahel and West Africa, spanning peacekeeping and regional strategy. And he brings in the much valued government perspective, and particularly on how political leaders have to weigh climate action against competing and urgent demands. Your Excellency, Sierra Leone gives us a very concrete example of a country trying to connect climate resilience with economic recovery, human development, energy access, agriculture, and jobs. In a setting where there are many urgent demands, what makes climate action a priority now? And what does that mean in practice for the choices government has to make? So if you could elaborate particularly on how political leaders decide where the climate action fits, that would be appreciated. Over to you, Your Excellency. Can you hear us?
Yes. Yes, we can.
Perfect.
Can you?
Did you?
Yes. Okay.
Did you hear my
Yes.
question? Did
Yes,
you hear
definitely.
the question? Okay.
Definitely.
Then
Definitely.
over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. First, I must say that for us as a country, and climate action is a priority. I had the singular honor, I was invited by the World Bank to launch the World Bank Country Climate Development Report, I think a couple of months or last year or 2 years ago for Sierra Leone. In that report, I take three things. First, the report stated that Sierra Leone is among the 15 most climate vulnerable countries in the world. Second, and that between now and 2050, if we don't take concrete actions, we are going to lose 9 to 10% of GDP. The same report indicated that about 600,000 people within that same period will slide into poverty. And when you take those 3 points alone, you realize that this is a very fragile scenario. And in as much as Sierra Leone, we are paying for crises that we are not part of, because we are not part of that industrial revolution and pollution that is creating all of these problems for us today. Yet still we are the receiving end, and as a result for us it's a national priority. Like I've just said, when you have those 3 points put together, that is a very fragile scenario in itself. What does that mean? It means that a fragile country like Sierra Leone sees fragility not as a phase that we have to go through step by step, as a trap. And this trap is reinforced by 3 things. One is that we are now in a very unpredictable period wherein domestic resources are not enough to match our development ambitions. Second, we are confronted with rapid population growth. I just indicated in another panel today that today in Sierra Leone, a small population size, we have 720 kids that are born every day. That equals to like 15 classrooms per day. And third, we have a situation where we are confronted with overwhelming shocks and overlapping shocks. What does it mean? It means if you take the last couple of years, from COVID to the Ukrainian crisis, and then now to the Middle East crisis, and now that is affecting our economies in terms of increased food prices, in terms of increased fuel, electricity prices, and more importantly, international development assistance is growing, is slowing down. The windows are closing. So we feel all of these shocks at the same time. And what are the impact of that? The impact of that, we are forced to make very painful choices in development financing. Very painful choices in the sense that we have to decide whether investing in resilience is very urgent than paying teachers. Investing in education is very important than building a road, or investing in climate action as opposed to providing opportunities for vulnerable communities that are also suffering from climate action. So we feel the scale at the same time. So this is the reality of governing a fragile state. You have to make very painful decisions, although we see this. And I want to state that for us as a government, the safety of our citizens is a priority. Not that we don't take climate action very seriously, or that we don't move as fast as the climate timeline demands, but because we constantly have to make this kind of choices, wherein whether we want to pay teachers, whether we want to pay for healthcare workers, whether we want to expand our investment in the areas of health, education, giving access to more kids to go to school. The choice is not because we don't take climate actions as an urgency. It's the reality of just painful choices we have to make as a country. And those painful choices really does not allow us to have what it takes, does not allow us to have access to the kind of finances that we need to be strategic about climate action. Nevertheless, as a government, we believe that climate financing has to be strategic. Already in Sierra Leone, I must tell you, in the area of agriculture, energy, and health, we are making some very smart decisions. Today, we are working, we developed the Mission 300, which is supported by the World Bank and African Development Bank. In that, we want to increase access to electricity from 36% to about 78% between now and 2030. And most of that investment is really around renewable, transitioning to renewable, solar and hydropower as against fossil fuel. Equally so in the area of agriculture, we are working currently with the AgriConnect project that we are submitting in the next couple of weeks or months to the World Bank. We are focusing on smart agriculture. How do we engage in agriculture that does not additionally destroy the environment? Also with healthcare, the investment we are making in healthcare infrastructure. Today, we stand out as one of those countries in this region where we are trying to solarize about 1,800 healthcare facilities. We have started and we are moving. And today, most of those healthcare facilities, even in community areas, have access to electricity. So they are able to preserve vaccines. They are able to do tests. Labs are able to operate without using fossil fuel. These are some of the actions we are doing on this part. But the important point I want to underline is going back to the question whether this is a luxury. It is not a luxury for us. We are living the reality of climate change. Me, I come from the rural areas. I come from communities. These are largely agricultural and fishing communities. And I see on a daily basis, the additional support we give to farmers, the additional support we give to fishing communities. Yet still, we have not been able to address some of the vulnerabilities they face on a daily basis. So this is a reality for us. And today, the point also I want to make is that the cost of fragility, of managing fragility, is far below the cost of preventing fragility, is far below the cost of managing it. Couple of years ago, if you read the report, the country climate report that I launched 2 years ago, you realize that in Sierra Leone, not too far from where I am sitting, just about, I think, 10 minutes drive from where I'm sitting, we had a mudslide where we lost thousands of Sierra Leoneans. And these are some of the challenges we are facing on this side. For us as a government, this is a reality. But because today we are in what I call the politics of painful choices in a fragile context, where we have limited resources and we have to make choices, that are so painful, not that we don't take climate investment as an urgency, but because of those choices today and the costs that we get, the kind of international environment that I've just explained to you, where international development assistance is slowing down, and we are forced with very limited and closed domestic revenue space. This is pushing us to making some very hard choices, painful choices. Not that we don't realize the urgency of these things, but these painful choices that not give us the kind of laxity and the kind of space that we need to make very strategic decisions when it comes to climate change. Strategic in the sense that in terms of spending government money in those very areas. I've already outlined some of the efforts we are making in the area of energy transition, in the area of agriculture, and also in the area of healthcare delivery. But we can do more when we have the opportunity to have funding streams that are targeted, that can focus on job creation, that can focus on helping communities to transition out of this kind of vulnerability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, also for explaining that climate action in fragile and climate vulnerable settings is not an abstract agenda. It has to connect the things that governments and citizens are already prioritizing to cope with all the multiple challenges you just mentioned: jobs, access to energy, food systems, food security, public finances, and also service delivery. And you very well laid out that there are trade-offs, but that you also do strategic decisions when you are thinking about how to use the climate finance. So with that, let me turn to our next panelist. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Melinda Bohannon. She is the Director General for Global Issues at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, a career civil servant and economist, previously FCDO's Director General for Humanitarian and Development, and she helped lead the UK team negotiating the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Melinda, donors and development partners are central to this debate. But they also face, particularly now, their own pressures: tighter budgets, value for money scrutiny, risk concerns, and the need for all to show results. So the question is that from a donor and climate diplomacy perspective, where do current partnership models for climate action in fragile settings fall short? And what would be a more realistic and effective model require from donors, governments, MDBs, and climate finance institutions? If you could elaborate. Thanks.
Super. Thank you very much, Chair, and delighted to be on the panel. And I must say, I thought the two first speakers set that out really well, Mafalda and His Excellency in Sierra Leone. And I guess I want to start with a point that Mafalda made to answer the question directly: where do they fall short? Finance tends to flow predictably where countries are stable, and there is a stable plan and a proposition which enables the government to reach out to international organizations with a medium-term perspective and attract finance behind it. The whole point with climate fragility is that it complicates that situation, and it complicates it in several ways. It means that medium-term strategy is somewhat harder. It means that countries are more vulnerable to shocks. It means that the drivers of conflict, fragility, and climate together work to undermine stability. And it means that as a whole, the system is challenged in how responsive it can be, how rapid it can be, how agile, and how localized. So the basic challenge is, how do you adapt a system which is based on stability into one which is fundamentally about managing fragility, to state the obvious? I think I would sort of point out a handful of ways in which that is particularly acute. I mean, the first is when we talk about humanitarian response. So this is where populations are in dire need. Very often that response brings in finance, it brings in food, it brings in support to populations. Rarely has it been designed with tackling the underlying drivers of climate fragility in mind. A second is when we think about scale-up tools, perhaps which the bank has, the crisis response window or the other MDBs. Again, it's more about how we scale up rather than how we do differently whilst we're scaling up. And the third is, I would say, and as Mafalda knows, climate finance organizations, at least not initially, haven't been set up with crisis windows. They've been set up to support partners who have long-term strategic plans. And this is something that Mafalda is very proactively managing, but the initial design was very much based on stability and on long-term planning. So in a nutshell, what's missing, therefore, is how you design and deploy instruments that support resilience and livelihoods in a fragile setting where the drivers of climate, conflict, and fragility all overlap. We think the solution is to ensure that climate resilience in effect is built in, integrated, but particularly built into rapid response. So for countries that need international support quickly, making sure that we are responding in a way that supports resilience and acts on climate risk at the same time. Quite often that means understanding what those vulnerabilities are and working with local organisations in particular that have a comparative advantage in managing them. Secondly, it's about building capability and early warning systems baked in to support countries with their scenario planning, but particularly thinking ahead about where is climate change likely to impact on their planning and make them more fragile and vulnerable. And then lastly, it's about supporting shock responsiveness for the future. So as Mafalda described it, building buffers. So we know for many countries, whatever crisis they are facing, and I think we just had this articulated by His Excellency from Sierra Leone, the buffers aren't present. Quite often countries are forced into really difficult choices and trade-offs. And certainly internationally, we need to make sure that the financing architecture is designed with response buffers in place. So what is the UK doing about it? Well, and I think all of us as development actors have observed this problem. We can describe the problem well. The question is, what can we program differently, and how do we use our shareholding of these international organizations differently in order to encourage a more joined up response? We, for example, developed a program, the Resilience and Adaptation Fund, where we endeavored to work with 8 fragile and conflict affected countries to support them in how they integrate climate change and fragility to climate impacts into their strategies. So, for example, that involved supporting them with early warning. As I've described, we worked with the UK Met Office on climate modelling and brought those to the benefit of the countries in question. We supported their ability to access the GCF. We worked with Somalia and Chad on that basis, for example, so helping them in FCV settings develop programs which were open and able to access GCF support. We've worked to build disaster risk and responsiveness into the international architecture. So examples of that include parametric insurance. It includes rapid response windows when disaster strikes. And it includes the sort of wider set of insurance products through paying premiums, which help countries access resources quickly when they need them, particularly after climate disaster. And that's been particularly helpful for countries, for example, in the Caribbean that have been vulnerable to hurricanes. And we've invested a lot through the RAF, the Resilience and Adaptation Fund, in thinking about how we can build country platforms to put countries in the driving seat, but also work at the community level to build community cooperation around resource management. So results are positive. Clearly, this is highly relevant to many countries that we work with. The sort of conversation we're having feels very relevant. We've worked, for example, in Jordan, where we've supported refugees and local populations, for example, to manage shared water resources together. As I described, we've worked in Somalia to support access to the GCF. We've worked in Chad and the Sahel and other FCVs to produce strategies which join these dots together, as I describe, in a way that feels responsive today rather than set on medium points of success for the future. So what does that tell us about what we need from the international architecture going forward? I mean, I'd highlight a handful. Firstly, we really need climate integrated into the MDBs, the multilaterals in particular. And I know it's contentious, particularly now, to have climate targets, climate finance targets, or environmental targets for various reasons. But we really need to stick to those and make sure that we're supporting countries on their journey to tackle fragility and to manage their transition sustainably. We need better join up between the banks, the IMF, the regional banks, and the UN to make sure that diagnostics and analytical work is shared, to make sure that rapid response is joined up and managed in a climate sensitive way. And we also need, I think, to be conscious of the trade-offs that we started this conversation with. So inevitably, there will be some short-term job creation may well not overlap fully consistently with what we need and want countries and communities to do on climate resilience over the medium term, whether that be in agriculture or construction, infrastructure, cities. So we really need to make sure that the trade-offs are well identified and we have an honest dialogue about them, and we're supporting countries to identify how to manage them. And then lastly, I would say, I mean, to echo the point made by His Excellency from Sierra Leone, it is a lot easier it's a lot less expensive to invest now in resilience compared to managing the impacts of crisis later on, particularly on climate change. And so I think that is the mantra through which we need to go forward and think about how we create a system which is more joined up, more responsive, where climate is integrated, and we really try and counter the proliferation of different institutions, organizations, all trying to do the same thing with slightly overlapping mandates. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for bringing in the view of a bilateral donor, and also for telling us how you move forward and work at the country level, for example, by adapting the programming, taking into consideration also the challenges caused by the climate change. I also like your saying about that climate needs to be integrated into the MDB's work, which is something that I think becomes evident given the interconnection between development challenges and climate aspects. And lastly, you mentioned the importance of partnerships. So I would like to turn as a next speaker to Ugochi Daniels. She is the Deputy Director General for Operations at the International Organization for Migration, which is the UN Migration Agency. You have a long-term experience in fragile settings. And I would like to bring in the human mobility dimension in fragile. We already have heard about it from His Excellency in Sierra Leone. But in many fragile settings, climate pressures and displacements are deeply intertwined. And the people most exposed are often those already displaced or hosting others. So the main question to your organization is, climate change is increasingly a driver of displacement and a stress multiplier in already fragile settings. Where is climate action most clearly a lifeline rather than a luxury for people on the move and the communities that host them? And how should mobility and displacement change the way climate action is prioritized and delivered in FCV contexts? Ugochi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I know when you started your intro, you were saying maybe there would be, we'd identify some areas of tension between the presentations. I'm going to disappoint you a bit because I think there's actually great alignment from all of us as panelists, but from different perspectives. So certainly for IOM, climate action and human mobility, it's not just an environmental agenda, it's stability and peace, it's development, and increasingly it's a mobility agenda. And if we don't get it right, then His Excellency described it very well. It's a fragility trap if we're not able to connect these different issues that all converge around what many countries are dealing with, whether it's climate, conflict, displacement, food insecurity, rapid urbanization, or the financing, the shrinking fiscal space. Again, His Excellency spoke to this. From IOM, we take a very strong people's perspective because people don't experience these challenges separately. So the question is whether we are investing early enough to manage those risks before they become crises, or as His Excellency said, are we investing smartly? We know that last year, disasters triggered nearly 30 million internal displacements. But the most important lesson here is not about the numbers. It's that climate impacts, displacement, and instability affect the same communities. And that means our responses must be equally integrated. So here I'm echoing Melinda. So in direct response to your question, for IOM, climate action is a lifeline when it's able to deliver 3 outcomes. So one is reducing the risk of displacement. Second is strengthening resilience and adaptation solutions. And third is contributing to peace and social cohesion. And we see this in our work on climate, peace, and security. So 3 concrete examples. Somalia, where we integrated climate adaptation, natural resource management, livelihood support, and community engagement, and worked with local authorities and communities to strengthen local governance and support peaceful coexistence. So we're scaling this across our work in fragile settings because the evidence is clear. When climate stress intersects with weak governance and social tension, investments in adaptation also become investments in peace. And we've also seen this in displacement settings. So if I move to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, there are climate resilience measures included watershed management, environmental rehabilitation, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable energy access. So this helped to protect both the refugees and the host communities while reducing environmental degradation and strengthening social cohesion. And then my third example is from Iraq, where with investments in climate resilient livelihoods and agriculture, we were able to support job creation through agribusiness value change and financial inclusion. So what do these 3 examples demonstrate? There's a broader point here, and that is climate action delivers its greatest value when it's designed around people, places, and mobility realities, and not around sectoral silos. And if we're serious about addressing climate mobility at scale, we must move beyond projects. We need investments. From where we sit as IOM, and we're an organization like many UN agencies that does a lot of analytical work. The gap is not around evidence. It's the absence, what we see is the absence of mechanisms that are capable of translating the climate mobility risks into investable solutions for financing mechanisms. And I always remember a discussion I had with someone who was representing, he'd been nominated to represent his country in a World Bank discussions on climate funding. And he said there was, if I remember correctly, there was 8 billion on the table to be allocated, and every dollar attracts $5, so technically 40 billion, and they were only able to allocate 750 million. And that's because they did not have good bankable solutions. And that's why, as IOM, we're advancing a new generation of climate mobility financing and innovation instruments. So to understand this, what our investment facility is trying to do is transform the challenges into investment-ready opportunities so that countries can invest smartly, and connecting the risk analytics with national planning, locally led adaptation, sovereign investment support, and private sector engagement. And this is particularly important because in these settings, catalytic and blended finance can be transformational. And then with our innovation labs in Asia, Africa, the Pacific, Middle East, and the Mediterranean, these labs are enhancing our diagnostics, they're accelerating locally led solutions, and they're testing innovative approaches to identify scalable models. Innovation in this case, is a bridge to local action and large-scale investment at the same time. And we're also supporting countries to strengthen their ability to anticipate future risks. So this shift from reacting to displacement after it occurs to investing before it happens has to become the new normal. So I conclude with 3 reflections. The first is that climate mobility must move from the margins of climate and development policy to the center of investment planning. Second is that climate, peace, development, and mobility financing must converge around shared outcomes. And third, we need greater ambition in our financing solutions that are locally led and are investment ready. And so that's why climate action is not a luxury, and it's one of the most strategic investments we can make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ugochi. I pick up one aspect that you mentioned, which is the absence of mechanisms translating climate finance into investment-ready opportunities. And also, you mentioned how IOM contributes to remedy this. Now, going back to one of the statements that was that climate needs to be integrated into the MDBs, gives me the perfect segue to hand over the floor to Guangxie Chen. He is the Vice President for Planet at the World Bank Group, leading its work on climate, food, agriculture, environment, forests and biodiversity, and water security. And Guang, you will bring the delivery perspective on how development institutions scales climate outcomes through mainstream investment, and also where the limits lie. So let me ask 3 connected questions to you. The first one is one that we had been talking about at the bank a lot, climate and jobs, jobs being very high on the bank's priorities. So as the VP for Planet, covering, as I just mentioned, climate, environment, water, food, and agribusiness, you oversee sectors that are both deeply affected by fragility, but also central on how people earn a living. Where has the World Bank Group's work across these sectors translated into real jobs and economic recovery in conflict-affected settings? And what made those investments work?
Thank you, Patrice, for moderating these excellent sessions, and it's an honor to join this panel. Being the last speaker on the panel, a lot has been said already, and I agree with all that has been said. So there's a lot that I can add to that, but I think I will perhaps pick up some of those points that from the World Bank Group's perspective. One, I think the central question is this luxury? Obviously, it's not. Because we see climate investment is about smart investments. The way to address conflict fragility is to focus on what the source of the fragility and conflict, which is about people's livelihood at the bottom. At the end of it is a foundation. It's about people's livelihood. It's about jobs. If people have decent jobs, better jobs, and a good, strong livelihood, the sort of risk of fragility obviously reduce. So that's really the fundamental of the other principles that govern the World Bank Group's engagement in FCV settings. So really, we want to help countries to create jobs, strengthen livelihood, and then manage the risk before they become real facilities. And that governs our work. And some of the principle has been discussed about how do we approach this work from the experience that we have. It's all about focus on development priority that matters to our community as their urgent need. And it's all about working through local actor institution. Of course, you work with national government, but I think the localities and the community engagement is most important in terms of setting priorities. And then at the end of the day, again, it's about creating livelihoods and jobs. Maybe I can share a few examples of the work that we do to illustrate some of this. In Yemen, one could argue that it's one of the kind of most fragile country that we work with. We are supporting an education project, actually through IFC, private sector arm of the World Bank Group. But under that project, we also support a small renewable energy source as a way of supporting these school facilities. And of course, this is climate financing, and we're benefiting from the tools that we have with the support of our financing partner, which is the private sector window of the IDA facility that have enabled us to provide such a support. In Sahel, which is arguably another sort of most fragile region in the world, we are supporting this regional pastoralism support project that across 6 countries. And this is a second phase of our work. Again, we address the fundamental of the fragility in this part of the world, which is really the migration corridors and the water pond that pastoralists really depend on during drought. And this will create minimize that conflict between herders and farmers in the local market. And this is obviously working in a fragile environment in that particular region. But it shows that it can be operated even in those fragile settings using the facility and the principle that I described. So the other area is the point about FCV setting is obviously not the same across different countries. We work on all of them. I mean, think about the case in Ukraine or Mozambique or Mali. They're all on our FCV list, but of course the setting is very different. So we need to look at the sort of the key foundation of that facility in this different country setting and design our program accordingly in addressing the fundamentals source of that particular conflicts. And also, I would argue that while we are a World Bank Group, we talk about investment, we talk about lendings, but what is going to be most important, particularly in the current ODA environment, is the really pivoting to outcomes, making sure that our investment can deliver the outcome for the community and for the country that we're working on. And this is, again, is about minimizing that fragility, the source of fragility, by enhancing livelihood and creating job opportunity. And that explains to many of the investment that we're doing now is all, as Patricia as they say, at the World Bank Group, is all center and jobs, creating jobs for job that is already there, creating better jobs. And that is the way we can address the source of the facilities. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Guang, for bringing in the perspective of the World Bank Group. And since we also would like to move to the Q&A session and hear the questions from the room and also online, let me conclude this specific session with asking all the panelists as to whether you have heard something from one of your fellow panelists that you would like to reflect on, something that maybe you have heard also from our 2 participants joining virtually, Mafalda and Your Excellency. Is there anything that you thought would be important to respond to across the different panelists, something that resonated, something where you had maybe disagreement? I hear there is a lot of alignment. You mentioned that already, but maybe something that you think from a panelist perspective would be useful to sort of like also get the input from another panelist. Is there anybody who would like to come in?
I'm happy to.
Okay.
I'm happy to respond to one of the points His Excellency make about the fact that as a policymaker, you're forced to make very painful choices. We appreciate that. We understand that. And that's why, you know, part of our World Bank Group's engagement in your country, in other countries as well, is to make that less painful for you in making those difficult choices. And that's where we, you know, how some of those facilities that actually mobilize the resources to address some of the challenges that you face. And also, I think the work that you highlighted on the country climate and development report is really also to frame it in such a way that can help you to prioritize where your intervention will be. And of course, then we bring in our financial resources to support some of those priorities that you highlight. And we totally agree with you about, managing the risk before they become a fragility, whereas the fundamental tools, which is where I think some of the innovation that we have embarked on over the recent years, from the most recent the crisis response toolkit to something that we started some 15 years ago of catastrophic deferred drawdown, which is a facility now. We started 15 years ago in Central America, but now is over 60 countries in the world that taking up that kind of facilities. And of course, we also develop instruments that addressing climate-related vulnerability in countries like the Caribbean, South Pacific. Again, I guess the fundamental point is to make it less painful for you to make that choice, while recognizing that you still have to, as a policymaker, you still have to make those choices. Thank you.
Thank you, Guang. Anybody else? If not, we will move to the Q&A session. Or you wanted to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mr. VP, for making that statement in front of the World Bank country manager and his team, that their role here is to help me make those painful decisions less painful. But I also want to agree with the Vice President on his approach with job creation. With job creation, that is a real challenge. Just in the previous panel, we are making reference to all the initiatives, the World Bank initiatives around Mission 300, around the AgriConnect, the Health Compact. But one thing I highlighted there that is missing, one is the convergence shock, where means there are no integrated approaches that tie all of this together. The second point I made mention of is also the lack of a job compact. How do you develop a job compact, that can really focus on job creation? I'm very happy that you highlighted that as one of the vehicles, of fragility. And so I want to thank you very much for that. The other point I just wanted to make was the one that our sister has started off the panel about the kind of investment. I totally agree that, international financing is slow, like our sister in OIM made mention of the amount of money that was mobilized, and then how much of that was actually spent. We know that the instruments, sometimes, like I said in the previous panel, we have to rethink some of these financing instruments, how they could come faster, because climate financing is not like any other financing. It demands urgency, it demands timeliness. So how do we make those instruments flexible in a way that they are able to respond, and also to focus on what I usually call differentiation? Every fragile context, every country has their own different level of fragility. If you design an instrument, those instruments to speak to the specificity of the fragile context of those countries. So I want to thank you. I just want to make reference to those points that previous speaker before me made. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And Ugochi, please.
Just very quickly, the point I want to make, building on what Gwen said, also on what His Excellency said, is that climate finance on its own is not going to resolve displacement, fragility, or conflict. It needs to be part of an integrated approach that's looking at jobs, looking at livelihoods, access to basic services, access to land and water. Mafalda also spoke to this, but equally very important, governance, protection, as well as social cohesion. This is the would I say, the people aspect of the solutions when we are looking at the financing, when we are looking at the context, and when we are looking at the integration. It has to work for people. And we have to be able to, our investments have to enable people to make choices to stay, choices if they're going to move, that they can move regularly and with dignity. So just to conclude on that point, because I don't want us to leave thinking that the climate finance is not a luxury and that it's the silver bullet that solves everything. No, it needs, as His Excellency said, be an integrator, addressing the drivers that interplay within the context. Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we would like to open the floor for questions. So there is an online possibility, but also here in the room, I already see some hands up, and I will then hand over the floor first to you. Maybe you can also quickly present yourself, your name and the organization you work for.
Perfect. Thank you very much for this great panel. I'm Farishta Sahi. I teach at George Mason University, and I'm also the founder of a new established NGO named Global Resilience. I'm a native of Afghanistan, and my question is about the international response to the climate change and climate crisis in Afghanistan, particularly when it comes to reaching women and households who are in the villages, and considering this current environment where the regulatory environment is quite restrictive, restrictions on women are very, very high. And also even UN agencies, women working with the UN agencies and other international organizations have limited access to go to the areas where people are affected by climate degradation, particularly drought, floods, or recent earthquakes. So I want to understand what are your approaches and how it is working considering the current restrictive environment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I will take 2 to 3 questions at the same time to give our panelists a moment to reflect, but also to ensure that everybody has a chance to ask the question. I see, I think you are from Proparco. We were together in the dinner yesterday night, right?
Exactly. It was a good dinner.
So that was helpful.
It was a nice dinner, by the way. Yeah, so Thomas from Proparco, which is the French DFI. And in Proparco, I work on fragility issues. Yeah, my question was, I think the panel made a very good, convincing demonstration that, climate change is not a luxury. If you connect it with to fragility and to the problems that people face, access to energy, access to water, food security, capacity to resist climate shocks. So that was very convincing. What is also clear to me, and that's my question, is that many of the investments that need to happen in these frontier markets will be private sector investments, will be driven by the private sector. If you are talking about food security, access to energy in many cases is, also private sector projects. So my question to the panel, I don't know who wants to take it, but how, systematically as a collective group, we can do better in, making more private investment possible on these climate adaptation issues in FCAS countries.
Okay, thank you. One more question from the floor, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Awako Gufu, medical epidemiologist from IGAD Secretariat. I want to bring out one question on the nexus between climate fragility and health emergencies. So, the growing trend is that we are getting a lot of health emergencies which have somehow related to climate. Of course, you cannot rule out, for example, the current Ebola outbreak that is ongoing in the African continent, in DRC and Uganda. Similarly, cholera outbreaks and other, epidemics generally in the region. So, but what I kind of see a bit of disconnect in terms of the climate nexus. How can the bank, what are some of the proactive efforts to kind of enhance advocacy and financing targeted towards addressing these kind of climate, kind of predicted health emergencies? Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, let me turn to the panelists. You can respond on one question or on several. To repeat, one is climate finance in Afghanistan. The second one is from the French DFI Proparco, also the role that the private sector can play and how we can come together as partners. And then the third one is the nexus, climate, fragility and health emergencies. So let me see whether we can see the hands from our panelists joining virtually. Maybe I'm not sure, Mafalda, if you're yes, okay. Maybe I give you the floor first because you're so far away, and then I will turn to my panelists here. Mafalda.
Thank you very much, Beatrice, and to my co-panelists, very stimulating discussion. And indeed, I don't think that there's a lot of divergence. There's a lot of convergence, as a matter of fact. To the specific questions, I will just very briefly on private sector, as I was saying, it is possible to make investments. Investments are happening in different sectors. What we see in terms of our portfolio, what we see as big opportunities is empowering small businesses through either the local commercial institutions and financial institutions or through even equity structures. And in sectors that were mentioned here, agriculture, energy, and so we are exploring multiple structures, multiple partnerships to incentivize and encourage more private sector investments. I gave the example of Djibouti, first utility scale wind farm. We have several equity funds, for example, in Africa, in the agriculture sector, in the energy access sector. And we are also in the M300. We recently approved $250 million to support the M300, so energy access in Africa. And I expect that some of those investments will be through private sector. On climate health, again, what we are seeing is an increased focus and interest. There's quite a bit that has been done actually between the health funds, WHO, and GCF and other organizations to propel the agenda forward. We ourselves also have a pipeline of projects, and we already have several projects under implementation. There's also quite a bit of work on analytics in trying to understand climate and health vulnerability assessments, what should be priority investments. And they take criticality in FCV settings as well. Let me just say on the lady from Afghanistan that we ourselves, we are exploring how we can support Afghanistan, and in particular through also non-state actors. You gave the example of constraints that women are facing. So I think we have to be very deliberate as well in our interventions in driving opportunities for women and driving gender equality. So let me pause here.
Thank you, Mafalda. Maybe now from the room, Melinda?
Yeah, happy to. Thank you. I'll just pick up on the gentleman from Proparco's question of climate investments in FCV settings. As the UK, we think it's really important to lean strongly into how we mobilise private capital at scale through our BII, our British International Investment Facility. And we recognize that in order to do that effectively, we need to do it deliberately, and we need to have a clear investment instrument that is targeted specifically at climate finance. So we've set up a facility specifically for that under BII, which will work including in a range of countries, including in fragile states. But it's precisely designed to mobilize capital behind climate sort of smart sectors, if you will, whether that be infrastructure, agriculture, water, cities, urban. And it's eminently possible, but obviously the trick is finding the investable proposition that can absorb capital at scale. Now, as we've just talked about, we just need to be clear that those opportunities exist, because clearly they do in many countries. Lots of countries are FCV, but that doesn't preclude those sorts of possibilities. But it's the practice of how you do it, which doesn't undermine resource extraction, fragility dynamics, environmental insecurity, and that requires expertise. It requires very careful analysis. It requires very careful investment choices. But I think it's one of those things which we need to take a bet on being able to do, because it isn't the case that there aren't any investable propositions in FCVs. Of course there are. But as I described, it's about the practice of how you do it, not just the volumes that you're putting in. On the link between climate fragility and health emergencies, I couldn't agree more. Actually, I'm very taken that one of the main themes, for example, of the UK Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, is precisely to explore the links between vectors that impact health and climate change. And health has been described as a climate emergency, or climate as a sort of an impacting health emergency. And we know exactly what the drivers are. It's temperature rise, it's natural asset depletion, it's water pollution, water scarcity issues. So again, I mean, coming back to this point about one of the things we've all talked about, helping countries with early warning and planning and analytics, that's precisely the kind of join up that we really need to get much more integrated into how countries are thinking about the combined response between social protection, hospitals and health services, and economic development, and building adaptation and building resilience to climate change. It's the sort of thing which lots of organizations internationally are developing their expertise on. It's the kind of information that you need to make available as a public good. But I think, again, working in silos doesn't help it. So it takes very informed, very far-sighted policymakers in country, and us as development actors able to establish those connections and join the dots. Thanks.
Thank you, Melinda. Anybody else would like to jump in?
Yeah.
Gochi?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Your Excellency, you would like to take the floor?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think on Afghanistan, what the professor was underlining there is the same kind of issue that is confronting other countries. The only different, we have the same structural reality. You have compounding crisis in a country like Afghanistan with very limited resources and also very limited international support. I believe when you look at Afghanistan has its own specificity. As somebody that has worked in various peacekeeping environment, what will require is to make the instrument for support really flexible and adaptable, focusing essentially on building both state and non-state domestic response capacity. Because for you to, if you take Afghanistan, you take the geography of Afghanistan, for communities, for cities, for towns that are far removed from Kabul, to access international financial resources for climate action becomes very, very difficult. But if you are able to develop, if the international financial instruments are able to focus on developing domestic capacity for that response, because it becomes very difficult for international organizations, climate organizations, to function within that kind of environment. So the focus should be on flexible financing instrument that will allow communities, local organizations in Afghanistan to access that kind of resources. On COPACO, I think the model for private sector financing is to move away a little bit from big envelope financing. When you want to target financing that could support communities, they have to be small envelope financing. They should not have to be, you have to look for, there are some institutions, I think like Copaco, if you do a portfolio, apply for financing, private sector financing, above a particular, within a particular envelope, it could not be accepted. So they have to think about very innovative form of financing that are very small envelope financing, that could take into consideration small businesses that can be react. On the emergencies and climate change, I think this is where I spoke on the last panel, where unpredictability becomes a vehicle of fragility. You know, already communities are facing very difficult circumstances like in DRC. And then if you add health emergencies to that, it's going to just compound fragility at low. That is also where I called for flexible instruments that are flexible, that are fast, that are not very slow, that can react to this kind of scenarios. So those are just my response to those 3 points that we highlighted.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. And Ugochi, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'll be super quick because I know we're out of time and I'm reading the body language of our okay, so super quick, and I'm more than happy to follow up subsequently because we don't have a lot of time. To the question from the IGAD Secretariat on health emergencies, and IGAD, you're actually one of the few regional groups. You do have a framework that integrates cross-border mobility. So my question would actually be back to you in terms of how have you factored in health resilience in your risk analysis? And certainly from the perspective of IOM, when it comes to health emergencies, we're part of work on pandemic preparedness, but also looking at what's happening at points of entry across borders. And we are actually working with Wellcome Trust that Melinda had mentioned. So more than happy to follow up with you on that. On Copaco and the point about private sector investment, so there are 3 aspects to this. So one is for IOM in our innovation labs, we're actually co-creating what we call bankable solutions, or Melinda, you called it investable propositions, that includes the private sector. So that's one. The second is on blended finance. We're also working with Aon on parametric insurance. But a key private sector group that we work with is the diaspora. And the diaspora there's real opportunity there in terms of not just blended finance, but also in coming up with the solutions at the local level where they're most needed. Which takes me to the question from Afghanistan and the approaches. Just very quickly, and I would never want to underplay how significant the challenges are for women and girls in Afghanistan. But just to say what we had done that was very successful was investments in small businesses that are women-owned. And what we saw is that with investments in these businesses, they were able to employ more women. And when I say small, it's less than 30 employees. And we saw after 18 months, after 24 months, not just that they had been able to employ more women in their communities, but that they felt they had more options in managing their mobility. So yes, it's very, very difficult, but it is not absolutely impossible. And this speaks to the resilience of the women in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ugochi. And yes, this Fragility Forum holds many, many other interesting sessions, and we are out of time here. We actually would have more questions, but they will be answered through the technical chat, I think. I would like to close this discussion and first of all extend my thanks to the panelists for contributing to this rich discussion and put out 3 reflections. First of all, after what we heard, I think there is a lot of convergence. You talked about where you see similar challenges, and from where I sit, I think it's important to see that the different partnerships are really important as the different institutions bring their competitive advantage to the fragile and conflict-affected settings, climate finance, to provide solutions to these challenges. And maybe also one other point is that climate finance needs to be integrated into a holistic development and policy approach. We heard that from the different speakers. And with that, again, thank you so much also to the audience who participated and asked questions. And I wish you a nice continuation of the Fragility Forum. Thank you so much.